Hey guys, Jay here, welcome to EonsOfBattle, and in this video is all about how I upgraded my airbrush setup. I'll be repairing and reviewing my current airbrush, the Harder & Steinbeck Infinity CR Plus, and reviewing my new airbrush, the fan favorite Badger Patriot 105. And finally, to test it all out, I'll be painting a Space Marine librarian using only airbrush. Stay tuned. Well gang, I've been in an airbrushing slump for probably 2 or 3 years. Back in the day, when my airbrush was new and shiny, I used it for almost everything. I got it probably a year after I started painting models, and I remember it was a game changer. I would whip it out for everything. I remember being really proud of painting this orc truck in an afternoon. The truck has since seen better days, but I still have the nostalgia. The tool was new and exciting, but as the years have gone by, I found myself refraining from using the airbrush. I find myself more often than not fighting with my airbrush, clearing clogs and getting less than perfect performance. These days, I pretty much only break out the airbrush for doing a Zenithal Prime and maybe a one-color base coat. I know that there's so much more I could be doing, and as my pile of shame grows, I think it's time I fixed this mess. Another poor decision on my part that I think has been contributing to me not getting an amazing airbrush experience is that I've been putting my airbrush through the ringer on a daily basis. I spray Windex, alcohols, enamels, oils, thick body acrylics, inks, and the airbrush can handle it, but the seals and internals aren't indestructible. And I have not been zealous in the cleaning, which you absolutely should be as an airbrush parent. This brush is meant to be treated like a princess, and not a frontline soldier. So I have formulated a plan to upgrade my setup and get me back into the airbrushing game. I will fix my Infinity and get it working like new again. Then I bought a new airbrush that'll become my daily carry. I hope that this 1-2 punch will be the thing that makes me fall in love with airbrushing all over again. So let's get down to business. I got my order in from Spray Gunner to fix my Infinity. A new set of gaskets, a 0.15mm needle, and a 0.15mm nozzle. The first thing I did was a complete disassembly of my airbrush. The regular parts all come off by hand, but I did need some tools for parts like the air valve and needle seal. Now, I used just regular screwdrivers for this and it did the job, but really it's not a bad idea to invest in the airbrush screwdrivers for your airbrush. Those can't damage the parts. So the first thing I replaced was the needle gasket. I had never taken this apart before and I was surprised to see 3 little gaskets fall out. The last one didn't want to fall out, so I had to pick at it with the point of my airbrush needle, which probably wasn't smart. I could have used a pin. Once those were out, I got out the new gaskets. I found 4 of the new gaskets were a match, but I only needed 3, so I checked them by inserting the needle. 3 of them fit snugly, but the 4th was loose, so I guessed that was the one meant for the air valve. Then I disposed of the old gaskets, which looked a lot smaller. I wonder if they shrink over time. Once my fresh gaskets were in, I checked it with the needle and it was a tight fit, which is good. I don't want any paint leakage. I then reinserted the needle seal and tested it again by inserting my needle, and it fit like a glove. Then I popped out the old air valve seal and replaced it with the new one. Then dumped the old one. Then I replaced this tiny O-ring on the air valve pin. This one was easy, I just yanked the old one off and rolled the new one in. Then I reinserted the pin and I could put the air valve back together. Then I found this large flat rubber gasket that didn't seem to go to anything, but it was a perfect fit between the air valve and the 1/8 inch air hose nipple. No more Teflon tape for this airbrush. As I reassembled this part, you'll notice some ugly scratches on my airbrush. Well, this piece can get stuck if you aren't careful. It only needs to be tightened finger tight, and if it's stuck, do not use pliers to unstuck it. Eventually, I got it loose with a pair of rubber gloves and a small vise. This is an expensive airbrush, and you don't want to do what I did. Next, I ran into another problem. This gasket between the airbrush waist and the airbrush handle looks big and doesn't match any of the gaskets that came in the kit. I suspect that they didn't give me this part because it's not a pressure fitting, and I can probably just get the part from a hardware store, but it's still pretty annoying. The next part was also a bit of a head scratcher. This part is definitely a Teflon gasket meant to go between the paint pot and the body, but it just seems too big. I gave it a few pokes, but it didn't want to budge. I decided that the current piece is still in great shape, so I decided not to try and replace it. Now for one of the most important ones, the O-ring in the air cap. This part takes the most wear and tear as the part comes off every time it gets cleaned, and it gets hit with the water and cleaner, so replacing it periodically is a must. With that, the airbrush should be just like new, and I reassembled it. I did hang on to all the old parts though, just in case. I know those work and I could put them back in if there was a problem. As I put it back together, I did notice that this is a mighty fine looking airbrush. And now it's time to replace my old janky 4mm nozzle with something much finer, a microscopic 0.15mm. Seriously, I cannot make out the hole with the naked eye. Then I unpackaged the needle, and similarly it is so sharp I can poke my skin and it goes through without any resistance. I installed the new needle and nozzle, and now I have the finest airbrush setup on the market. And there we go. Assuming that I haven't damaged any of the hard components, this should be a brand new airbrush. Now this airbrush I plan on using only for acrylic paints and inks. My plan for this brush is to be all about fine detail work, highlighting, shading, and OSL, object source lighting. I will pamper this airbrush and treat it right with lots of cleaning and all the needle juice it can handle. So with that finished, I still need an airbrush for spraying yucky stuff, like oils, primers, polyurethanes, enamels, alcohol, hairspray, and anything else I can think of. So for that, I decided I needed a new machine. So now I will present my new acquisition, the Model T of airbrushes, the Badger Patriot 105. Now, a little peek behind the content creator curtain. I actually picked this up a couple of weeks ago and have been using it a lot. And it's great! I thought I was using a big needle in my Infinity, but this Patriot 105 puts out paint. This machine will be my daily driver airbrush for now on, and costing only about a fourth the price of the Infinity, I don't have to be worried about putting horrible stuff in this brush. With replacement nozzles costing about $4 and the needles costing $6, I can roll those dice if I want to try spraying something particularly nasty. These brushes are great and should allow me to paint better and faster. While I talk about each one, I'll be spraying on some paper to show you exactly what each brush can do. But before we get to that, let's do a quick pee-pee break, a Patreon plug. We make wargaming and modeling videos at breakneck speeds, and if you want to support us making more, the best way to do it is over on Patreon. You'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, voting on what I paint live on YouTube, extra live streams every week, and more. With that out of the way, let's get back to the airbrushing reviews. To review these brushes, let's start with the Infinity. This is a really nice airbrush. Its design is sleek and sexy, but it's very expensive. The construction is top-notch, with the head cap and nozzle cap being one part that are attached with beefy threads and a nice rubber gasket that comes off with 2 turns, and it has never let air leak out. It is expensive though. It's also chrome-plated, so paint doesn't stick very well to it and it wipes clean when you're done. It's also expensive though. It's basically perfect in every way, but it's also way more expensive than any other airbrush on the market. And it performs really well, but I don't think it performs 200% better than other airbrushes. It is very nice and I like it a lot, but I don't think I can recommend it to anyone else. The Badger Patriot 105 is nice. The area inside the cup that allows paint through is about 4 times the size of the Infinity, so this thing can put out the paint. I've primed with the Infinity for years and I wasted so much time. This thing can do it in about half the time. It does have some oddities. It needs a converter to make the air valve compatible with the common 1/8 inch fitting. The nozzle cap takes about 3 revolutions to remove, and I've had consistent air leakage there. So I have to stick some Teflon tape in there to fix it. And its parts are much more robust than the Infinity, so it doesn't clog hardly ever, but it does tend to get gunky in there, so it's best to clean it anyways after a few colors, even if it's still spraying. Overall, it's a perfectly good airbrush and it should continue to run great forever. So with this setup, I was feeling invincible, and I thought to myself, could I paint an entire model with these bad boys, no brush required? I had to find out for myself. I could have made it easy on myself by painting a zombie or maybe a night haunt model that could easily be painted with the airbrush, but I wanted it to be a real challenge that I might fail at. I'm going to be painting this Space Marine Librarian in Terminator armor from Space Hulk using only airbrush. With lots of hard edges and small details, this is a model that should really push these brushes to the limit, and I'm really excited to see how it goes. Now, this terrified me for 2 reasons. Number 1, I have no idea how this is going to turn out, and number 2, I almost never do something on camera for the first time. I've always found that that's a recipe for disaster. But I feel pretty confident in my airbrushes and my ability, so I decided to go for it. Now, this model was already zenithaled for me, so the first step was to apply my base color. The first thing I did was I loaded up some Minotaur Ghost Tint Plasma Discharge into my Badger Patriot to base coat this psyker. And if you have an airbrush, you should absolutely own these paints. They are transparent candy colors that run through the airbrush beautifully and tint your model. They come in 12 colors and I can't recommend them enough. Next, I put some Games Workshop Lawthorn Blue into my Infinity. I tried to do some highlighting and it worked, but I found it was too close in color to the blue that I already had on the model. So this step was mostly a wash. To make these highlights more dramatic, I put some white ink into my brush and sprayed that. This worked much better, and I sprayed on some spots on all the raised edges of the blue armor. Then I tinted these white highlights a little with more plasma discharge from my Badger Patriot. So far, I'm loving this two-gun setup. Next, this part was madness. I am base coating all the red bits, and I decided I needed to know just how accurate I could be with this brush, so I went in guns blazing, no masking. And it worked. It's definitely got red in parts that I wanted, like the shoulder pads, storm voltage, and purity seals. But it also got a little red overspray in the areas that I already painted blue. It still did phenomenally well, but it's still not a paintbrush, so I'll have to do a little cleanup. At this point, I was noticing that I was getting some severe tip dry on my Infinity 0.15mm setup. This was frustrating as no paint would come out, but I found that when this happens, I just need to wipe the needle with a damp brush and this instantly removes the paint and lets me spray perfectly again. At this point, I decided very reasonably to introduce some masking into the paint job, and I used Silly Putty over all the red areas. Silly Putty works great for this because it's not sticky and there's no risk of it pulling off the fragile airbrush layers. I also have a video on this. Now that I've gotten red on my blue, I decided to go ahead and do all my details and then fix the blue last. So I'm running some P3 Iron Hull Gray through my Infinity and spraying this on the Stormbolter, Power Axe, and Book. I was also getting a much better feel for the 0.15 airbrush and was getting much more accurate with it. I switched to Vallejo Beastly Brown and base coated all of the cloth and paper bits of the armor. I probably could have used this on the gold details too, but I didn't think of it in time and hindsight's 2020. Once those paper parts were sufficiently brown, I highlighted them with some more white ink. Ink runs through the airbrush beautifully. I also used this to highlight the metal base and the gray weapons. Next, I put some black ink into my airbrush, and this was a game changer. It flows beautifully. Almost didn't have to pull back on the trigger for ink to flow out of it. With a little practice, this black ink through the airbrush could revolutionize my painting. I decided to go ahead and shadow everything. After that, I put more Silly Putty over the areas that I used colors and went back in with some Vallejo Magic Blue to fix the areas that I'd gotten some overspray on. This was kind of a pain, but the model is a learning experience, putting the brushes through their paces. And in no time I had the armor nice and re-blued. Now it was time to unmask everything, which is always a joy to do. Revealing what is underneath is like Christmas morning. Next, I picked out all the details with some P3 Heartfire, which is a yellow. I could have masked this, but there's not enough hours in the day, and I figured I now had the experience to pull it off. And it was successful. Then I put some Vallejo Warlord Purple into my Infinity and painted the Psychic Energy on the Force Axe and on his head. I went back in with some white ink after to highlight this pink. After that highlight, I went over these areas with some Minotaur Ghost Tint Magenta to blend these areas into a Force Crackling energy effect. Now that the model is finished, it was time to focus on the base. I wanted to do something to separate the base from the model, so I decided to splatter some orange on, and I used orange ink through my Badger Patriot, with super low pressure for this, which was the wrong move. The orange ink was way too saturated, and so it looks more like orange dots than subtle rust. I should have watered down some orange acrylic paint, but again, that darn hindsight. I then put some Minotaur Ghost Tint Brown into my Badger and gave the base a nice dousing, and I liked it so much I also sprayed it onto the paper details of the model, and then it was done. No paintbrushes have ever touched this model, and I'm pretty satisfied with the results. I may have had delusions of grandeur that I could completely replace brushes with airbrushes, but it's not a bad model either. I could plonk this down in a game store and I don't think I would get laughed at. It's very decent and I'm super excited to paint a model using both the awesome airbrushes and my paintbrushes. This is the start of something great, a new dawn of painting. Now I'm not saying to go out and buy this exact setup. I'm just sharing my journey. And don't stop believing that you too can have a good airbrush experience. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.
Your face is so perfectly in there. It's insane.